you can see, this is pre-recorded, and I am here on Zoom with you as we watch. As we go, please just put any questions that you might have into the chat, and I will try to answer you either immediately or as we finish. So, let's talk about Shirley Jackson. Absolutely one of my favorite authors, especially for her short stories, and just one of the most fascinating figures, I believe, in the horror and Gothic fiction genre. I'm going to give you a little bit of background about Shirley Jackson, and then we're going to talk a little bit about this week's story, The Lottery, which I know some of you have read. It's sometimes assigned, especially in 10th grade, as part of, oh, the 10th grade textbook, sometimes in 11th grade as part of an American literature course. And so you might have read it before, which is fine. You might not have read it. And I think everyone ought to read The Lottery. For a lot of people, The Lottery is the only Shirley Jackson story that they know. We are going to remedy that for all of you during the coming weeks here. So you are going to be Shirley Jackson experts by the time we end this month. So buckle up. All right. Shirley Jackson was born in San Francisco and she spent her childhood in Burlingame, California. Her family moved east when she was 17 and she attended the University of Rochester. Shirley Jackson, while maybe being born on the West Coast, is known as more of a East Coaster, and a lot of her stories take place in New England. She entered Syracuse University in 1937, where she published her first short story, Janice, and was soon appointed the fiction editor of the campus humor magazine. She marries her husband at Syracuse University, Stanley Edgar Hyman. He has his own literary career. She basically helps him with that and starts a literary magazine, The Spectre, with him. Shirley and Stanley moved to Connecticut as Shirley Jackson settled into a life of raising children, running her house, and writing in between. One of the many, many reasons I love Shirley Jackson is that she is a normal person. She writes, and she's a very prolific writer, but she does it in between all of the things that you do in life, raising kids, helping with her business, running a household, all of these things she writes in between. So Shirley Jackson began having her stories published in the New Republic and the New Yorker, and the first of her four children was also born. In 1944, Jackson's story Come Dance with Me in Ireland was chosen for the best American short stories. 1948, the New Yorker publishes Jackson's iconic story The Lottery, which generated the largest volume of mail ever received by the magazine, before or since. All of it, almost all of it, was hateful, absolute hate letters. People got so angry about this story. They thought it was absolute blasphemy. Now, to give you just a little context for being published in the New Yorker, even today, and it was true in 1948 certainly too, but even today, you have a better chance of being struck by lightning than you do of having your short story published in the New Yorker. They are notoriously picky. So for her to have, as a woman in 1948, writing a horror story published in the New Yorker was incredible. But it holds the record as the story that has generated the most mail in communication. In history, in the history of the New Yorker, and almost all of it was hate mail. So, 1959, The Haunting of Hill House was published, followed by We Have Always Lived in the Castle, named as Time magazine as one of the 10 best novels of the year. Shirley Jackson was an absolutely incredibly prolific author, short stories, novellas, magazine articles, novels. She became a preeminent voice for female horror authors, especially the Gothic horror genre. So, what I really find interesting about Shirley Jackson as well is she didn't just write Gothic fiction and she didn't just write horror. She also wrote humor. There's a whole series of books about her children that are actually intended to be funny, and they're quite funny. They're quite humorous. She wrote short stories. Not all of them are horrifying. In fact, she seldom incorporates anything that's supernatural or otherworldly into her stories. A lot of the time, her stories simply center around interesting people who may or may not have a very firm grip on reality, or maybe they do, and it's everyone around them that's the problem. We Have Always Lived in the Castle. There is believe it's Prime Video. There's a movie version of it that's actually pretty good. There's a incredibly fantastic movie version, 1963, the black and white version of The Haunting of Hill House. That's fantastic, and I suggest you all watch it if I don't have time to post it for you during the course of this class. So let's talk about Gothic horror. Like, what is Gothic fiction? Gothic fiction is a genre defined by horror, death, and elements of romance. Now, this is an interesting thing, right? Because elements of romance. So horror could be anything. It could be horror of other people. It can be horror of threats against you. It could be supernatural, but doesn't have to be. Death doesn't always mean literal death in Gothic fiction. It could be the ending of a relationship. It could be the ending of a communication, the ending of an era in your life. So it's not always literal death. And romance doesn't always mean literal romance in Gothic fiction. It can be literal romance between two people, right? But it doesn't have to be. It could be close relationships between parents and siblings. It could be close relationships between friends. But it always has the element of one person being a bit maybe codependent or dependent upon the other one. So it's not always romantic love, but it's sometimes the relationships that fall into the romance category can be seen as just more of a familial binding, if that makes sense. Think Frankenstein, Dracula, or any kind of Edgar Allan Poe. Shirley Jackson pulled the genre into the modern world, combining horror, both supernatural and psychological, death, the fear of it, the danger of it, and complicated interpersonal relationships. This is a great era for Gothic fiction. There are so many good examples out there in the movies and TV and streaming right now. Black Mirror, Twilight Zone, Us, Parasite, Midsummer, just to name a few. I have a Gothic fiction page on my havener.weebly.com website. Please check it out because I have a bunch of suggestions if this sounds at all interesting to you. Shirley Jackson did not have an easy life. She really did not. She had a pretty tough life. She grew up with an overbearing perfectionist mother who grew to be increasingly critical of her daughter's work, her appearance, her husband, her family. Incredibly critical. And we're going to look at some articles and some stories about Shirley Jackson and how she struggled with this. 1962, shortly after We Have Always Lived in the Castle, Jackson suffered a nervous breakdown and a bout of acute agoraphobia, which prevented her from leaving her own home for nearly 2 years. She suffered from acute anxiety and depression her entire life, and she was very vocal about it, which during the 1940s and 50s was pretty rare. People didn't talk about this back then, and she did, which of course made people think she was already, a little off because she was so vocal about talking about her mental illness. She did suffer an acute breakdown. She did suffer agoraphobia, which meant she had a fear of basically leaving her house. But she worked through it. She pushed through all of it. Her work often depicts a duality of character, or two halves of a singular personality. She sometimes wrote that she felt two halves of her own personality, which she named Snarly and Charlie. Many theorists believe this duality was her statement on the position of women in the 1950s American life. I love this because I think all of us sometimes feel like we have two different people inside us, like the person who comes out and faces the public and the person we are maybe when we're in private. And I don't think Jackson thought she literally had like multiple personalities, but I think she definitely felt the pressure of who she was supposed to be, especially given 1950s life, and who she had to be. So the impact of Shirley Jackson cannot be overstated. Although a preeminent voice in literary fiction and horror, Jackson is virtually overlooked in the literary canon. The Lottery is really the only story that is regularly included in school reading lists, which is why most people only know her from the Lottery and maybe The Haunting of Hill House if they're horror fans and they've read the book. Until recently, she was discounted almost entirely from the horror genre. She's really getting a resurgence right now, and I am beyond thrilled to see that. Shirley Jackson was the unsung literary genius of her time. She was prolific. She was a prolific author to works that have become the backbone of the horror genre. Versatile, often jumping genre and writing light-hearted comedies and depictions of her children and family life. She was not afraid to move outside of the genre that she was known for. A lot of authors are. They're terrified that they're going to lose their audience, they're going to lose their voice, they're going to lose the people that read their books. She didn't care. She wrote what she wanted to write when she wanted to write it, which is incredible. She shunned the social expectations of the day, defying her abusive mother, her philandering husband, and carving out a name for herself despite the odds. Her prose is lyrical and precise, word choice and language is unique and cannot be duplicated. So many of the tropes we take for granted, especially in the horror genre, are owed to Jackson's work. This is absolutely true. So many of the things you see play out in horror movies and shows and streaming and books and whatever come from Shirley Jackson. And we're going to talk about some of those as we go through her stories. All right, so that's a little overview of Shirley Jackson. I want to take a few minutes and talk us through The Lottery, which was your reading for this week. Like I said, many of you have read The Lottery before, and that's awesome if you have, but some of you may not have. It's not always a regular part of your 10th or 11th grade curriculum. It just isn't, and it should be, but it's not. So if this is the first time you've ever read The Lottery, congratulations. And if you've read it before, then you had a bit of an easy week, didn't you? Because I know this week was a little bit crazy with everything. So let's talk our way through The Lottery. The morning of June 27th was clear and sunny, with fresh warmth of a full summer day. The flowers were blooming profusely, and the grass was richly green. The people of the village began to gather in the square between the post office and the bank at around 10 o'clock. So we start this in a somewhat timeless village. Is it present day? Is it from the past? We don't know. It's called a village for one thing, but also there seems to be a lot of tradition involved, a lot of traditional roles, a lot of just traditional behavior. So it could be present day in kind of an old-fashioned town. It could be a little ways back. Uh, but we have no indication here from the beginning that anything is wrong. All of the people from this town are simply gathering in the town square, right? Because they have a lottery. Now, I want you to, as you read this story, really pay attention to how does Jackson play with our connotation of what a lottery is, right? We have an idea of what a lottery is. We want to win it, right? But think about our preset notions of a lottery and how she turns that upside down. We get some information about the lottery here. You know, the original paraphernalia for the lottery had been lost long ago. The black box was now resting on the stool that had been put into use even before Old Man Warner, the oldest man in town, was born. There's a great deal of fussing to be done before Mr. Summers declared the lottery open, lists to make up, heads of families. So this is just business. You know, we're talking about the business of the lottery. The heads of the household, basically their names are written on a piece of paper, put into the box, and then they have to find someone. It's usually the man, the head of the household in this rather old-fashioned traditional town, who would come up and draw, right? Draw a piece of paper. But they're figuring out the business. Who's going to draw for, um, who's going to draw for this person, right? Me, I guess, a woman said, and Mr. Summers turned to look at her. Wife draws for her husband. So, if don't you have a grown boy to do it for you, Janie? So Mrs. Dunbar has to go do it herself, right? But, traditionally it would be the man, the head of the household, that would go and draw. So I want you to think about what Old Man Warner implies is the purpose of the lottery here. Shirley Jackson is fantastic, just like Ray Bradbury, at showing us, never telling us. She trusts our intelligence as we read stories, and she doesn't just give it all away. They do say, Mr. Adams said to Old Man Warner, who stood next to him, that over in the North Village they're talking of giving up the lottery. Old Man Warner snorted. Pack of crazy fools, he said, listening to the young folks. Nothing good enough for them. Next thing you know, they'll be wanting to go back to living in caves. Nobody work anymore. Live that way for a while. Used to be a saying. Lottery in June. Corn be heavy soon. So some towns are giving up the lottery. And you got to wonder why they would want to do that. Sorry about my dog absolutely losing his mind outside. Oh boy. So some towns are starting to give up the lottery, right? But old man Warner says, "Oh man, they're idiots, pack of fools," he said. "Young people wanting to change the world." But you have to ask yourself, why would they give it up, right? What's so bad about this lottery that some towns are starting to abandon it? Okay, so now we're drawing. Now the heads of the households are going up and drawing their slips of paper. People began to look around to see the Hutchinsons. Bill Hutchinson was standing quiet, staring down at the paper in his hand. Tessie Hutchinson shouted to Mr. Summers, "You didn't give him time enough to take any paper he wanted. I saw you. It isn't fair." So Bill Hutchinson has drawn the piece of paper with a mark on it. That's the problem. Everybody picks a piece of paper. If it's blank, you're off the hook. If it has a little dot on it, you are not off the hook. You have won the lottery. But we are implied right here that this is a very scary and terrifying thing to have happened. And Tessie Hutchinson, his wife, objects. "You didn't give him time. It's not fair." "Shut up, Tessie," Bill Hutchinson said. "We see some aggression here." Now, some people do talk to their spouses this way. I don't advise it, but it's not typical. So think about what she's showing us, not telling us, but what she's showing us about the level of aggression that's maybe associated with this lottery. Mr. Graves had selected the 5 slips and put them in the box, and he dropped all the papers but those onto the ground, for the breeze caught them and lifted them off. So now individual members of the household have to draw. Now all the papers go back in, including the one that has the dot on it, and now individual members of the Hutchinson household get to draw. "It's not the way it used to be," old man Warner said clearly. "People ain't the way they used to be." Here's cranky old man Warner complaining about the flow of the lottery. I mean, maybe he's complaining because Tessie Hutchinson is being so vocal about it. That's very possible. Maybe he's complaining because it's just taking too long or the tradition is broken down. But he's just, he's being kind of an old man here. He's just saying, this isn't the way it used to be. Well, the Hutchinsons are about to draw again, right? And even little Davy, the little boy who needs help picking up the paper from the box, and they have to redraw. So we've broken it down to the Hutchinson family, and now the Hutchinson family has to decide which one of their members of that family win the lottery. Tessie gets it. Tessie draws the piece of paper with the dot on it. As a matter of tradition, a matter of ritual, and even Tessie's own children take part in this ritual. So again, we're playing with the idea of what is a lottery, what are our preconceived notions of a lottery, what it means to win one. Tessie Hutchinson becomes absolutely hysterical when it is clear that she is the one that has drawn the piece of paper with the dot on it. She even, pay attention in the story, because she even tries to sell out her own family. This is how desperate she is to get rid of this piece of paper. "No, no, my grown children should have to join our family and draw pieces of paper." She tries anything she can in her desperation to try to take the heat off of her, but it doesn't work. Although the villagers had forgotten the ritual and lost the original black box, they still remembered to use stones. The pile of stones the boys had made earlier was ready. There were stones on the ground with glowing scraps of paper that had come out of the box. Delacroix selected a stone so large she had to pick it up with both hands and turned to Mrs. Dunbar. "Come on," she said. "Hurry up." The children had stones already, and someone gave little Davy Hutchinson a few pebbles. "It isn't fair, it isn't right," Miss Hutchinson screamed, and then they were upon her. And that's where we're left. We know what happens. They kill her by throwing rocks at her. Even her little boy, her toddler of a boy who can barely big enough to pick up a rock, is going to participate and throw a few pebbles at it. And that's where she ends it. This is the story that has generated the most mail, the most complaints in the history of the New Yorker, and one that has burned its way into the canon of not just horror fiction, but Gothic fiction. Think about the connotations that she paints in here. What is the purpose of a lottery? How does she turn this upside down? What is the tradition here? Why are they doing this? We have a town that, while it seems very traditional, seems far too modern for such an what we would consider barbaric ritual, right? These are people who have families, live in houses, do their dishes. This could be any town in the 1950s, right? Any small town. And this is what they do. And not just them, everyone. Old man Warner complaining about the people who have given up the ritual. All right, guys, don't go away. I'm going to end after this recording ends. I will answer your questions in the chat. And I hope you enjoyed the story. I hope you enjoyed, I hope you're going to enjoy all of the Shirley Jackson stories that we're going to read. And put all your questions up there in the chat. Thanks, guys.